Strengths and weaknesses of three forms of linear functions. Number 1. Identify some strengths and weaknesses of slope-intercept form. Recall that slope-intercept form, in general, looks like y equals mx plus b. Now, some of the obvious strengths of slope-intercept form is that it's easy to identify the slope and y-intercept from the equation. For instance, if I gave you the equation y equals negative 2/3 x minus 7, you could easily determine that the slope of that line is negative 2/3 and that the y-intercept of that line is 0, negative 7. The m, remember, stands for the slope, and the b stands for the y-coordinate of the y-intercept. Another strength, you could say, is that it's relatively easy to graph from the equation. So if I gave you this equation, y equals negative 2/3 x minus 7, you can locate the y-intercept, and then using the slope, just go over 3 and down 2. Over 3, down 2, and so on. Now, you might ask yourself, what are some of the weaknesses of this form? Well, one of the weaknesses is that it requires work to determine the x-intercept. So, for instance, this equation that I gave you, y equals negative 2/3 x minus 7, it's not immediately obvious what that x-intercept is. So, that would be a weakness. As we'll see soon, some of the other forms, it's much easier to come up with the x-intercept. Another weakness is, if you're given 2 points or a slope and a point, it takes work to find the equation. So, for instance, if I were to give you the slope of a line is 5, and it goes through the point 7, 2, it's not so easy to come up with the equation. It requires a little bit of work. Which brings us to the second problem, which is to identify some strengths and weaknesses of point-slope form. So recall what point-slope form looks like. It looks like y minus y sub 0 equals m times x minus x sub 0. So y sub 0 and x sub 0 are the x and y coordinates of a point on the line, and m is the slope. So an obvious strength of point-slope form is if you are given a point and a slope, it's relatively easy, it's relatively easy to write an equation. So for instance, just a moment ago, I gave you the slope of 5 and a point 72. If I gave you this information, if you were using slope-intercept form, you'd have to do some work to find the slope-intercept in order to write the equation. However, if I give you this slope and this point, to use point-slope form, it's simply a matter of substituting the 2 in for the y-coordinate, the 5 in for the slope, and the 7 in for the x-coordinate, and you come up with the equation almost immediately. So that's an obvious strength of point-slope form. Another strength would be that it's about as easy to graph as slope-intercept form is. You remember that one of the strengths that I mentioned is that it's relatively easy to graph. So I would say that it's also pretty easy to graph an equation in point-slope form. So for instance, if I gave you this equation, you'd be able to identify the point 72, and you'd be able to use the slope to plot more points. You would just go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over 1, and you would be able to graph the line. So that's another strength. Well, what are the weaknesses? I would say that one of the primary weaknesses is that it's relatively difficult to find either of the intercepts. So, if I gave you the equation y minus 2 equals 5 times the quantity x minus 7, I don't really know what the x-intercept is, and I also don't know what the y-intercept is without doing some work. So I would consider that to be a weakness. Now, 3. Identify some strengths and weaknesses of general linear form, which is also sometimes called standard form. I actually usually refer to this form as standard form. Standard form is ax plus by equals c. Now, don't confuse the b in general linear form with the lowercase b in slope-intercept form. This b does not refer to the y-intercept. Now, one of the weaknesses of this form is that a, b, and c don't tell you much directly. What do I mean by that? So, let's say I give you the equation 2x minus 5y equals 30. Well, the 2, the 5, and the 30, well, it's not very easy to come up with the slope. It's not very easy to know a particular point on the graph. But the strength, or a strength, of general linear form is that it's relatively easy to find the intercepts. In fact, if I were to graph this line, the way I would graph it is not by finding the slope, but by finding its intercepts. And you might ask, well, why is it so easy to find the intercepts? Well, recall that if you want to find a y-intercept, you want to find a point on the y-axis. And if you have a point on the y-axis, its x-coordinate must be 0, because all points on the y-axis have an x-coordinate of 0. If you substitute 0 for x, the equation suddenly becomes much easier, because you would just be left with the negative 5y equals 30. And if negative 5y equals 30, that means y would equal 30 divided by negative 5, which is negative 6. Let me go through that one more time. If x is 0, the term 2x will disappear, and you'll be left with just minus 5y equals 30. And solving that equation is as easy as dividing both sides by negative 5. So when x is 0, y is negative 6. So that gives us the y-intercept relatively easily. Now, to find the x-intercept, all the points in the x-axis have a y-coordinate of 0. So if you substitute 0 for y, then the term with the minus 5y will disappear, and you'll be left with just 2x equals 30, which means x would have to be 15. So relatively quickly and easily, we come up with the x-intercept, 15, 0. And since we had the y-intercept, now graphing the line is as easy as connecting those points. So I would say perhaps the strongest strength of 2x, or of any equation in general linear form, is finding the intercepts. Another possible strength would be some word problems lend themselves to this type of equation. You might wonder if I could give you an example of that. Let's say that 3 hot dogs and 4 sodas costs $13.78. Well, how would you write such an equation to represent that? Well, if you let x equal the number of hot dogs and y equal the number of sodas, then taking this sentence, you can translate it into the equation 3x plus 4y equals 13.78. If you try to take this equation, or this situation, these words, and try to write an equation in slope-intercept form or point-slope form, I think it wouldn't be nearly as easy as writing this equation. So you can see that each of the 3 forms, slope-intercept form, point-slope form, and general linear form, each has its strengths and its weaknesses. That's why we have these 3 forms. If one form had all strengths and no weaknesses, well, we wouldn't need the other 3 forms. But depending on the situation, one form will be easier to use than others. And that's why it's important to master each of the 3 forms so that you can use whichever form is easiest for a given problem.